Welcome to MEDays session 19, the rise of emerging powers shaping a fragmented world. First of all, I'd like to say a warm thank you for Amadeus Institute to invite me once again to MEDays. It's really an honor to come here, and I truly enjoy it and appreciate it. My name is Anna Weiden. I'm going to be the moderator for this panel. I'm an associate fellow with the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. So what do we mean by a fragmenting world order? This does not imply a complete fragmentation. The world is also witnessing integration and the formation of new blocks. Fragmentation needs to be understood in the context of the situation in recent decades, when the United States provided leadership and geopolitical rivalry, gave way to international cooperation, shared regulation of trade, and a reciprocal interdependence. And a dominant ideology of globalization and global convergence prevailed. Compared to that situation, there are now various centrifugal forces at play. By fragmentation of the world order, we specifically mean a process that is unfolding along three main vectors. Number one is an increase in the number of power centers, and two, the emergence of geopolitics in economic and societal arenas that were previously shielded from it. And number three, an increase in the political strength of worldviews other than the liberal Western one that has been dominant in recent decades. As regards to power centers, the unipolar moment for the United States that emerged in the late 1980s has come to an end. Comparison with the post-war period are insufficient to interpret the current situation. Similarly, characterizations such as a new American century or a Chinese or Asian century are also inaccurate and do not provide an effective policy compass. The historical situation most comparable to the present is probably that of the final decades of the 19th century, when there were many dissimilar powers with strong economic ties. Back then, however, most of the great powers were Western, whereas today the global playing field is far more complex. And to help us discuss this very thorny but important topic, we have a panel of important and really interesting speakers that will help us straighten this out today. So let me introduce, first of all, our first speaker, Dr. Fadi Dao, Executive Director of Globe Ethics, which is an international non-governmental organization in consultative status with UN ECOSOC, dedicated to advancing ethical leadership worldwide. Dr. Fadi is also working as a visiting professor in religious diplomacy. So I'm going to ask the first question to Dr. Dao. What prospects do you see for peace building and interreligious dialogue in the context of the current fragmentation of the world order? And what would peace building and interreligious dialogue look like moving forward in this climate?
Thank you, Anna. Hello, everybody, and thank you for being here. So in a few minutes, to answer a very, very complex question, let me start by saying when we speak about interreligious dialogue or faith-based actor and peace building, we are looking at peace from the perspective of societal actors. And for a bit of context, this panel is about fragmented world and emerging power in this fragmented world, multipolarity. The question is to engage societal actor within this framework, this context of multipolarity and fragmented world is necessitate to understand first what do we mean by this fragmented world. So first, we witness a political divide, regional or sometimes international between neighboring countries or global, but increase in political divides. We have economic and technological competitions also, and we have cultural or ideological divergences. Those are realities, not necessarily negative. what is negative, in fact, is the weaponization of trade and tariffs, for example, in economic competition. Or what is negative is instrumentalization or weaponization of ethnic and religious narratives and identities. And what is negative is the erosion of diplomacy as a way of managing disagreement in a positive or productive way. So the problem is not the multipolarity, the problem is how today those differences or competitiveness are being used for nationalistic, or even less than nationalistic, personal or egoistic interests. So in this context, for example, the 2025, this year, Global Peace Index is showing that peace is deteriorating in 87 countries in the world because of this global context. So in this context, what could be the role of societal actors like peace builders or faith-based also actors, or interreligious and intercultural dialogue? I would say this is also very, very different from where we look at the question, especially when it comes to religion. If we look at it from a secular context, secular society, it's something, and if we look at it from a context where religious nationalism, for example, is rising, is a completely different thing. So the dynamics are really very much depends on the global, but also the local context. And it's good to have in mind that 80% of the world population identify in a way or another with a faith or belief or religions. This does not mean that they have the same attachment to their respective religions, but more than half of those 80% says in global surveys, they say that their public choices and political thinking and choices is also related to their belief, religious or non-religious belief, but is influenced by their religious identities and belonging. So in this context, the double context, the deterioration of peace and world order on one hand, and on the other hand, I would say the rise of ethnic or ethno-religious nationalism and tensions. What could be and what would be the role of societal actors, including faith actors? I would say, if I need to summarize this in one word, I would say multi-stakeholder diplomacy. In fact, in a moment where in our world globally we are seeing a kind of failure, let me use the term failure of diplomacy, because when we have more wars, more conflicts, this means that we are failing somewhere, and the first actor to prevent conflict is diplomats, and so diplomacy. So what do we need today is multi-stakeholder diplomacy. To give one simple example, the Middle Eastern, very complex and multiple conflict, I would say the Middle East, but starting by Gaza, Israel, recent also war and atrocities happening there. So we have been working, and when I say we here, it's my organization, Globetics, but with other partners like the Interparliamentary Union, like think tank like Wilton Park and other partners, engaging societal actors, including faith leaders, in fact, to try to influence the trend of the situation in this context of horrible atrocities. The result is very limited. Why? And I'm giving this example for a very specific purpose, that the societal actors, their impact on conflict is very limited when it is a violent conflict, when it is war. But their impact on preventing conflict or post-conflict on reconciliation and rebuilding societies is more important. However, to be able to activate their agencies and their role, even pre or post conflict and violent conflict, the communication channels need to stay open all the time. And let me end by this, by saying that multi-stakeholder diplomacy means that societal actors, including faith leaders and faith actors, need to first believe that they can do something not only for their own community, but for their societies beyond their community. They need to have the right literacy and capacity to be able to engage in a policy framework and not a religious narrative framework. And thirdly, needs to be recognized in this role by other societal and political actors. If those conditions are met, then there are some examples where conflict could be prevented, or after post-conflict, rebuilding the societies, those actors played a major role in doing so. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those very interesting remarks. I think one of the topics that we think about also in connection with this particular topic is whether, the UN system is effective or not, and whether maybe a more multi-stakeholder model could be more efficient, something we can maybe discuss. I'll turn now to Mrs. Noemi Palfalvi, Chief Advisor to the Executive Director at the Danube Institute, and I'm going to ask her, what prospects do you see for Hungarian-EU relations moving forward, given the current polarization between these parties and the ongoing fragmentation of the world order? And then also, how does the fragmentation of the world order impact the international security of Central Europe? So those are two questions.
Of course. Thank you so much for the organizers for having me. This is my first time, but hopefully not the last. And thank you all for joining us, because the last panel is always very tricky, whether people will be showing up or not. This question, I would say, is a bit spicy in a sense that I wouldn't call the Hungarian-EU relations polarized, but I will elaborate on that. Hungary has been part of the European Union for more than 20 years. We are a European nation. Since religion was mentioned quite a lot of times, our country 2,000 years ago was founded on the Judeo-Christian principles, so we are definitely considering ourselves Europeans. The big questions when it comes to EU and member state relations is, what type of European Union does the member states want? And the current government's response to that is that Hungary supports the concept of Europe, of a strong Europe of nations, rather than the United States of Europe. And when it comes to the bigger scope, the fragmentation, and you mentioned a lot of power centers and where the European Union is in that sense, the problem is that the EU is no longer competitive. So when we have joined the European Union, we never signed up to losing our sovereignty, but rather we signed up to be part of a system that allows us to gain more power in the world and gain better perspectives for our respected nations. The problem is that this is not happening. The European Union is no longer competitive if you look at any of the data that's showcasing it. So where does Hungary see itself in this whole fragmentation debate? The Hungarian foreign policy is very much focusing on strategic autonomy, interest-based foreign policy, and sovereignty. I think it has a lot of very similar things to what Moroccan foreign policy is also doing. But the big problem is that the European Union is no longer putting a front, the European competitiveness front, and Hungary wants to be kind of like a keystone state in order for us to be a bit more successful. That's why we have a lot of relations with the Turkic states. We have very good relations with the global south. Our country is constantly criticized for having ties with Russia or China, but the reality is, as we discussed this before, it's different. The new power centers are emerging, and we need to have connections to all of them in order to be able to have a successful foreign policy. The other big question is really, what does it mean for our sovereignty? It's a bit of security. It's an interesting concept because, what do we mean under security? Obviously, when it comes to military relations, it's a bit more nuanced. But I want to focus in rather energy security, because I feel like that's one of the topics that, especially when it comes to our region, as the question was phrased to me, is concerning. Central Europeans are not able to not have conversations with Russia, because on the energy sector we are fully dependent on it, every single country of that. I would say that the Polish energy sector is the most diverse one, and now Hungary also has American LNG investments. And people need to realize that. People need to realize that whenever they are criticizing our nations and our foreign policy approaches towards different power centers in the world. So to answer your question in a nutshell, because I don't want to take more of the time, the question is not whether we want to be part of the European Union, what is the European Union's future, but the big question is what type of European Union we want to be able to be part of the power centers and to be competitive and to be able to engage with different actors of the world political order.
Thank you so much. Each of our panelists bring a different perspective and different focus on these kind of overarching questions of the panel. We're now going to turn to General Michel Yakovlev, French Army, retired after 40 years of service as the 3-star Vice Chief of Staff at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe. And he now teaches at Sciences Po, Paris School of International Affairs. And this is really an opportunity to ask questions from a military strategic vantage point. So I'd like to ask you, General, from a military strategic vantage point, what major challenges and or opportunities do you foresee because of the ongoing fragmentation of the world order? And also, where do you position yourself in the debate as to whether a multipolar world now truly exists from the vantage point of military power and alliance building? Is the US the sole remaining superpower, or is China now for real taking up the competition?
Thank you. Good afternoon, and I'm very glad and honored to be with you. So on the first question, the a result of fragmentation, we see it every day. It's the race to arms. The military budgets are exploding everywhere. And a second consequence is the brittleness of international relations, in the sense that we never had a perfect international order, but and the UN is not perfect, but we don't have a better alternative. And at least, to a certain degree, it helps diffuse frustration. It helps talking. Nowadays, people jump to their guns much faster. It's a bit like in a marriage. If at the first spat you start talking divorce, that is where we are now. So not only are there more and more weapons, but there are more and more people, nations, who consider that beyond a little polite talk, the first tool to be used is military power. And we've seen that very recently, and we're continuously seeing that. Now, in terms of multipolarity, so that was the first question, okay? Multipolarity and the US. I'm French. I'd like to believe in multipolarity. I'd like to have a rules-based world order. And in essence, we're not going to have that, mostly because America is killing it. Now, if America, and it's not only Trump, if America actually believed in a world, a law, kind of law and order, an attempt, at least a polite attempt at order before force, then I believe it could see off what it sees as the Chinese challenge, because America would be strong with a number of friends, and when you are America and your friends and allies are kind of the 10 other economies in the world, you kind of feel okay. But America, the Trump administration, is very busily destroying its system of alliances. Now, America has attacked its allies for 20 years on the economic front. As you know, they've practiced lawfare against, for example, every single oil firm, Statoil, the Norwegians, Eni, the Italians, Total, the French, Shell, BP, even Petrobras. They've been attacked for so-called corruption and tricked into paying billions of dollars of so-called compensation because they are corrupt. Not a single US firm has been attacked that way. I don't believe Exxon doesn't do corruption, quite frankly. And by the way, corruption has not diminished in the world, despite their best efforts. So America has, for the last 20 years, that's not Trump, has practiced massive lawfare against its best allies. And now it's going very open about, in essence, insulting all its allies and kowtowing to adversaries. So to finish off, I think we will shift from a US-led to a Chinese-led polar world in the next 20 years. Did it need to happen? No. All the natural advantages were in the hands of America, but since they are throwing all the advantages away, they are encouraging a number of nations to gravitate towards China. So I think it's not my desire, by the way, but my fear is that the end of we won't have multipolarity. We will have a shift in polarity that didn't need to happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks, General. Of course, this is a very kind of disputed topic, and we can see this from very many different perspectives. So we'll continue to talk about this. So we turn next to Mrs. Carola Ramon, Vice President of the Argentine Council of Foreign Relations, former Undersecretary of Economic Negotiations at the Argentine Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a former Undersecretary for Federal Planning of the Economy, Argentina. So the fragmentation of the world order does not only result in an increasing number of power centers. Geopolitical power is also projected within more arenas. In addition to the military arena, it is projected in trade, technological developments such as AI or quantum, via climate change, in food or information. What challenges and or opportunities do you see from your vantage points as in your new role? Yes, as president.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today. As you said, well, we're in a world, in a very fragmented world, as also my colleagues have been describing. And this fragmentation, is polarization, has impact on trade, but not just trade. Power is behind trade. And let me take a couple of minutes to describe the situation where we're in, because I think that will give us clues as to the opportunities and the challenges that you just mentioned. And I'm going to quote this. It's become one of my favorite quotes lately. I found it in a journal called International Security Journal from 1993 by an American author, Richard Betts. And the quote is, "Should we want China to get rich? For the realist, the answer should be no, since a rich China would move the current balance of power." I think that quote is fascinating. It was in 1993, and 30 years later, we have a rich China, a very rich China. And when we look, for instance, just one industry, we look that China produces 28 million cars per year, while the United States produces 10. Only one company in China, BYD, produces 4 million, which is the same as Germany produces in 1 year, and BYD increases about 40% year on year. So clearly we have a growing China, a very rich China with a very strong economic power, and the so-called trade war is not trade, it's power. It's pure politics, geopolitics, it's how are we going to slice this cake that is the world. Now, what happens with the trade war is at the end of the trade war, it's very simple. The end, we all know the end. The two big powers are going to agree. They're going to divide the territory and they're going to agree. Now, the important thing is what the rest of the world does, particularly the emerging powers, because these moments are crucial, also because we are under three other strains. One is the erosion of all the multilateral institutions, as you were just commenting, by its own creator. So the whole architecture that we've become used to since 1945, it's been slowly eroded by its creator, so we don't know where we're standing anymore. Secondly, there's the creation of new institutions by China. For many years now, China has been joining all the existing institutions by creating parallel I like to call it a multilateralism with Chinese characteristics. They're creating their own institutions. And thirdly, we're moving from a world where whenever we refer to trade, before we used to say, well, it's offshoring, it's outsourcing. Now we talk about friendshoring, we talk about weaponization, securitization. The vocabulary has become so much more confrontative. And that's where I think, and this goes back to the opportunities and challenges you mentioned, what do emerging powers and less developed countries like the ones in Africa and in Latin America, where I come from, do? Well, we are in a bit of a pickle because when you talk about friendshoring, that means you have to choose a friend. And this choosing a friend means choosing an enemy, choosing sides, and that can be very risky for us because we're not in a position to take sides. We cannot align with friends. We have to look for national interest. And that is a huge problem for middle powers. So this is a very important time for middle powers because it's a time also when a lot of countries are becoming more aware, particularly with climate change, of things like energy security, food security. I mean, look at the European Union after the war as well with the provision of gas. As my grandmother would say, they're realizing that putting all eggs in one basket is quite risky. So the countries, the middle power countries have the particularity that we hold the key to unlocking food and energy security. And that's where the importance of these new emerging powers arises in a world that, as my colleagues were saying, is fractured, and we have two main players, perhaps shifting to China. I agree with you on that one. So I think the main issue is to see, and perhaps we can discuss about later, so I'll stop here to let others talk. The main issue would be how are middle powers going to do from here onwards to align their objectives and become more powerful or have more muscle in the new fractured world.
Thank you so much. So I think you're alluding to both challenges and opportunities. So that's something maybe we can discuss also. We'll now turn to Dr. Henri Barkey, who's an adjunct senior fellow at Middle East Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations and professor emeritus at Lehigh University. What role do you envision for Turkey moving forward geopolitically, military, strategically, and culturally in the projection of soft power in the current climate of global fragmentation?
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. This is actually an interesting question in the sense that some years ago people had this great hopes for Turkey. Turkey was going to be one of these new soft countries that were have soft power, would collaborate with the United States, with Europe, essentially to push for democracy and a new vision, if you want, coming from a country that actually is not Christian and also technically close to the Middle East. Well, a few years later, one can say that this is not happening, it's not going to happen, and in fact, Turkey is now run by a leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who is proving to be, for somebody who got elected with great hopes and brought in initially a lot of reforms, completely reversed himself, and now has been introducing rules, policies, and methods that are shocking. What do I mean by that? Turkey today is becoming almost, I would say, a prison camp. The main opposition party Turkish opposition parties has a number of leaders. The most important leader is the mayor of Istanbul, who suddenly, in March of this year, was arrested and thrown into jail on some invented excuse. Since then, in the last 6 months, 7 months, they have every week almost increased the number of shall we say, charges against Mr. Imamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul, that now he's being accused of crimes that requires him to stay in prison for 2,000 years. Now, I use this as an example, but in fact, Turkish prisons today are full of mayors, political leaders, civil society leaders, journalists who are being jailed and kicked out of their jobs and for no reason whatsoever, except for one, that they are being perceived as a threat to Erdogan. So here's what I'm trying to get to. Turkey has now instituted, or Erdogan has instituted, a one-person populist authoritarian system, right, that has essentially changed every single rule you can think of. There's no rule of law. Free press there is no free press in Turkey. Just this week, one of the most prominent Turkish television journalists was sent to 4 years in prison for something he said in one program, because it was seen as a threat to the president. There are one of the most famous political prisoners is a man called Osman Kavala, who's a civil society leader, who Erdogan saw as a threat, and they manufactured a case against him, and he's been in jail now for 7 years. And you cannot appeal, you cannot. So, but what's interesting is with how every single rule and regulation that the Turks had instituted over the years have been undermined, changed by Erdogan. But Erdogan has been in power now for 23 years. And he feels threatened. He wants to stay in power for no matter what. So as far as he's concerned, what is important is to be able to figure out a way to change the constitution and then get re-elected once, twice. It doesn't matter. But the point is that there is not today a single institution left in Turkey that can stand up to him. Judges, prosecutors have been kicked out. They get replaced by people who will follow what Erdogan wants them to do, because if they don't, they'll be fired as well. But here is the absurdity of the situation. There's one institution which occasionally has managed to stand up to Erdogan, and that's the Constitutional Court. So when the Constitutional Court rules against the government, what does the government do? It says, we don't recognize the Constitutional Court's decision. We actually recognize the decision of an appellate court, which is one level below the Constitutional Court, and we will follow that ruling. So what does it mean in terms of the rule of law, in terms of the way the system works? Now, what's interesting, of course, is that Erdogan, because of all these policies, has lost essentially the stature he had gained at the beginning when he came to power. Nobody today essentially thinks of him as a leader. They just see him as another, should we say, strongman. Yes, Turkey is an important country. Turkey has resources. Turkey is critically located. So it has all these assets. So countries will collaborate, cooperate with Erdogan, whether it's Turkey's allies or other countries, but it doesn't necessarily mean that he has any respect or he has any, shall we say, soft power left. But I will just end by saying that this is part of, shall we say, a new phenomenon that we are experiencing that has been alluded to here already. This is an emerging authoritarian international based on strongmen. So the last one to fall, of course, has been the United States. We have Trump, who does exactly the same things that Erdogan does. He fires prosecutors. He doesn't recognize the Supreme Court when it doesn't suit him. He dismisses the press. Can you imagine in the United States, the Pentagon no longer has members of the press being represented? Right? He But this is a system of an authoritarian.
For those very somber remarks, but important remarks. We're going to turn now to Dr. Irene Mia, Senior Fellow for Conflict, Security and Development in Latin America at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. And I'm going to ask you, what role do you envision for Latin American states moving forward, geopolitically and geoeconomically, in this climate of global fragmentation? And I'm aware of the enormity of this question, but maybe try to sort it out if you can.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, indeed, it's it's a very diverse region, and my colleague and friend Carola probably has something to add as well. But yeah, I mean, I think more if we speak very in general, I would say that the region has been punching below its weight for a long time, because obviously it's a very big market. The geoeconomic power, potential geoeconomic power is very high. I guess it has been a mixture of, in many cases, the inability to speak with one voice, lots of kind of diversity, political instability, and also, frankly, also the lack of economic integration, because it's a very hard region to integrate with a lot of mountains and hard in the sense. And also, of course, the geostrategic position of Latin America very close to the US, right? So for many countries of the region, the US has been the main interlocutor and the main point of reference. I think going forward, there are important elements, I think, that could suggest that the region could, if, again, provided that there is an ability to speak with one voice and to actually have a coherent position vis-a-vis the rest of the world, there are elements which can suggest that the region could become more important at the global table. First thing I would say, it's what I call the green significance of the region. So the region, as we know, is obviously very important for the energy transition in terms of critical minerals. Most of the critical minerals, the reserves are in the region, in Argentina, in lithium, in Peru, in Chile, in Brazil. It's a region which is obviously very rich in minerals in general, but specifically critical mineral for the energy transition. Also, the Amazon, as we know, is we were discussing this morning, is obviously one of the lungs of the planet. So it is obviously, from a positive and negative, in the sense that, of course, Brazil has been for many years very protective of the Amazon as its own territory, but I think now it's shifting a little bit. So there is this idea of really trying to involve the world in protecting what is literally a world treasure for all of us, not just for the country. So I think this great significance actually put the region in a much better position vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Also, obviously, is a region which is playing a key role in global food security, and also global energy security. So obviously, that's important. Other element of less, I would say, positive geopolitical significance is the incredible power of organized crime coming from the region, which has become really, considering many accounts, really a geopolitical and geoeconomic power. It's something that we are working a lot at the AAS on the transnational power of those groups, which for us are really can shift policy across the world. And also, I think increasingly, talking about obviously the great power competition with China and the US, it is becoming an increasing theater for competition. Of course, we know that Latin America remains, I would say, in general, politically and security aligned with the US, but economically is a different story, right? The US is not the main, with the exception of Mexico, it is not the main trading or economic partner. China is. I think China's been very careful in the past not to really challenge the US in what the US has long considered its backyard in military terms or political terms, but I think increasingly we see the soft power of China rising in the region, because clearly Trump's agenda is an agenda which is, I would say, really, first of all, it's a very unilateral agenda, it's a very negative agenda, so it's all based about, coercion and economic coercion and political coercion with respect to the region. So clearly, the soft power of China is increasing, not just in the region, I think in many other regions of the world. And it's interesting when we look at surveys conducted in the region, we see that in many countries, China is perceived as the most respectful and trustful partner with respect to the US. So I think there is an opportunity for the region to play a bigger role. I think it's going to be important for the region also to follow a policy of what I call the strategic multi-alignment, so aligning within the region, of course, but also with other powers. We haven't actually heard much about the EU, right? That's another power which obviously in the region, but in general in the global south, could play a bigger role. Of course, it has its own issue of coordination and internal integration. But I think what we see increasingly is really trying to, and what the region, and I think in general many emerging powers should do, is really this kind of strategic alignment on specific issues with specific power. Yeah, so I would say that's my very broad panorama with respect to Latin America going forward.
Thank you so much, Irene. I'm kind of wondering then whether Brazil will once more become the driver for this or not. So
Brazil has been, I mean, as we know, I should be careful what I'm saying, because I have my Argentinian friends here, but Brazil has had for many years this ambition, right, to be the emerging power and to really be at the big table. I think it is, especially under Lula, is a very extrovert foreign policy. There is an ambition there. I think actually, to be honest, if we look also at how Lula has dealt with Trump attack to Brazil, actually, I think it was pretty impressive, because basically it really has restated, the channel of multilateralism going towards through the WTO and together with BRICS. So I think there is a potential for that. I think the problem with Brazil will be that, and for many other emerging countries, by the way, classic non-aligned countries, I think the problem with Brazil is that it's becoming increasingly different to what they're very good at, which is fence sitting, right? They always sit on the fence, so they try to, and by design, they're starting to align with whichever country according to what is the topic, and trying to be very independent. I'm not sure there is the room for independence or autonomous foreign policy is still there. I think with the US and China in this context is going to become increasingly difficult. And also, to be fair, I think Brazil hasn't been, I guess it's also by design. It has been, especially under Lula, it has concentrated very much on the international scene, but it hasn't actually been very successful in solving its own problem in its backyard, notably the Venezuela crisis. And I think that's also a bit of a failure. Or Haiti, I think we will probably need Brazil also to be a bit more present in his own backyard.
Thank you so much. And finally, we're going to turn to Dr. Vasif Husseinov. Pardon my pronunciation, but
you did it well.
Head of Department, Center of Analysis of International Relations in Azerbaijan. And I'm going to ask you, what prospects do you see for the EU-Azerbaijan relations given the current fragmentation of the world order? And also, how does this fragmentation impact the security in the South Caucasus overall? And that's also a very big question. I'm aware of that.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. First of all, let me tell a few words about Azerbaijan for those who are not familiar with. Azerbaijan is the only country in the world that's located between Russia and Iran. It's good and bad for different geopolitical and other reasons. And also, it is a country that is located on the key roads from the east to west, from north to the south. And coming to the question about the prospects of EU-Azerbaijan relations, this geographic position is giving a lot of substance for the prospects and present situation. But adding to that, Azerbaijan also rich with oil and gas. And it's another key factor in the present geopolitical and geoeconomic dynamics of the fragmented world. Azerbaijan is a key player in energy security of Europe, despite the fact that our natural gas supplies are not at big quantity, but it plays very significant role for Eastern European countries. In the case of some Eastern European countries, Azerbaijan is providing around 50% of domestic consumption of natural gas. And against the background of present situation between Russia and the EU, it is a very important factor for European energy security. And also, Azerbaijan is the only country which the EU can access to Central Asia and China without passing the territories of Russia or Iran. So the importance of this connectivity project and the role of Azerbaijan in that also affect the present situation and future prospects of EU-Azerbaijan relations. And at the moment, the situation is quite good between Azerbaijan, in the relations between Azerbaijan and the EU. We have initiated and launched lots of projects, not only in the sphere of oil and gas and connectivity, but also in renewable energy. Azerbaijan is the country the EU can use to bring the natural gas resources and also other resources, rare earth materials, from Central Asia to Europe without passing the territories of Russia and Iran. So in that context, the situation has reached very high momentum. And the fact that in the South Caucasus, the intra-regional conflicts have been resolved, primarily the one between Azerbaijan and Armenia. It was a conflict for 3 decades and was affecting all the situation concerning the South Caucasus and also relations between the EU and Azerbaijan and also other countries of the region. And thanks to God, we have already resolved that conflict. The occupied territories of Azerbaijan have been liberated. And EU also played very important role in the post-conflict situation, and particularly in peace process between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Armenia, for the first time, recognized Azerbaijan's territorial integrity in an EU-mediated negotiation process. And that clearly demonstrates how important role EU plays in the South Caucasus. And for the moment, as the conflict resolved, as the connectivity projects are very much important for the European Union and for Central Asia, the future prospects at the moment look quite bright.
Great, thank you so much. That was quite interesting. So I'm going to ask the panelists here if you have any questions to each other. Otherwise, we'll turn to the audience and open up for questions. We have, I believe, 14 minutes for questions. Someone has a question? Yes, see if we have the right here. Please also introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Good evening, everyone. My name is Fatmata Jabi. I'm from the Gambia, and I'm a PhD student in political science and global studies at the Mohammed Polytechnic University, working on the educational diplomacy of Morocco in West Africa. I have a question at the end, but for that I will have to build a context. As we all know from the theme of this event, we are living in very uncertain times. Trusts have been broken. Allies, traditional allies are no longer allies. The US is, acting up, and there is an emergence of emerging powers in certain parts of the world, in the global south, and the power dynamics are shifting. I think from the aspect of Europe, I don't know whether that's something that I can ask, but with Europe moving away in a bit, trying to redefine itself and trying to look for allies, what role do emerging powers have in that policy? And from the point of the emerging powers, do you see Europe in its entirety, or the EU, as a trusting partner who can stand on its feet, be united, and have a global foreign policy to define its future? Thank you.
Who would like to answer that tricky question? Yes.
Yeah, I feel like I need to start as a European, and I have been, talking a lot about Europe recently. I mean, from the Hungarian perspective, and this is what we are trying to push when it comes to the EU foreign policy agenda, is to have as many free trade agreements as possible. So, obviously for us, it is, and it would be important to engage with Gambia, with other African countries, with the global south, with the Turkic states, as I mentioned before. I think the problem is that Europe needs to first figure out themselves, it needs to focus on the internal problems, the competitiveness problem, as I mentioned it to you, and also, the rule of law problem, which is definitely something within the European Union, not on the states, within the European Union level, we are very much shifting away from what the founding principles thought of, and we need to focus on that before we are able to engage with the different parts of the world. But obviously, it would be great if we could be, a trusted partner in the future. I just think personally that the EU needs to first focus on the internal problems.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm from the EU, I'm French, old EU, as we say. We do believe we are worthy of trust. With all, warts and all, we're not perfect, but we do believe in a rules-based international order. We have no claims on anyone, and we generally believe, we should work together and not too much interfere with political systems. Now, look at the comparison. Russia, for example, has been saying, we have a big interest in Africa. The reality of Russia is that the Russian investment on the African continent is less than 1% of total investment in Africa. Also, 2/3 of what trade between Russia and African states is weapons. The only project of worth that Russia is considering entertaining is a nuclear plant in, I think, Uganda, which no one has seen. They haven't started working at it. So other than Wagner and private military companies doing security for dictators, basically, other than that, Russia brings nothing, zero, nada, to Africa. On the other side, it's a predator on gold and so on. The other power, China, has invested a lot in Africa and is still investing a lot, but for the last 3 years, Africa has been reimbursing debt to China. For the last 3 years, financial outflows of Africa to China are larger than Chinese outflows to Africa. So I'm not advocating cutting off from China and so on. They are very useful. They bring a lot. They have invested a lot in, for example, Morocco. We've seen that. So I'm not saying, cut off from China. I'm just saying that China is not necessarily as benevolent and generous as it pretends to be. It is doing business with Africa. And how much is it selling to Africa as compared with how much is it buying from Africa? Look at the figures. And in that respect, once you've looked at the alternatives, the more you look at the alternatives, the more as a European, I believe you'll love the Europeans.
Yes.
Yes, I wanted to add up on this comment. When I was mentioning before having a plural amount of friends and not choosing one over the other, of course I didn't mention the European Union, but of course the European Union is a huge player, particularly in the case of Argentina. European Union has been a very good, solid and trusted partner for many years. Since my French colleague is here, I really hope that the EU-Mercosur agreement, the long awaited, will be approved at the end of the year, because actually France holds the key to it. So that will be even more trust in the European Union. But apart from that, what I was trying to come up with before is something a bit more powerful than that. I mean, I think developing countries, whether it's the global south, you name it, we have to take advantage of this world as fragmented. And it's a very particular moment. I mean, what binds us together, I was in several panels, attending several panels the last couple of days, talking about the global south, energy, global chains. What holds the global south is a very elusive concept. But the common denominator is that we missed on the first round of globalization. We are the latecomers, the losers of globalization. And in this fragmented world, we have the chance to jump onto this new stage of globalization. And I think we have to take advantage of all the fora that we have, namely G20, BRICS, G77, whichever platforms we have, to align our interests and make sure that this new round of globalization, because as I said before, I do believe we have the key to unlock some of the greatest problems of our time, food security and energy security. And it's only developing countries that we can do that. Developed countries actually depend on us. So I think that is the right time to not just be with one or two friends, just with everyone and align with interest, not friends. So I think we really have to be, at this time and this moment in the world, we have to be very strategic. For us, and I'm coming from Latin America, there's something we're not is strategic. We can't do long-term planning like the Chinese. I wish we did, but we can't. But we have to really try, because it's in that strategy, in this long-term thinking, that we will be able to go through these. Argentina is sitting, as we're saying, in critical minerals. We have the 4th largest reserves of gas, the 6th largest reserves of oil. There's a lot we can do. Food, you name it, we can feed several Argentinas, the whole continent. So there is a lot to do, but we need to have a strategy, and within the strategy we need to be flexible, because in this world with two giants fighting each other, they can change many times, because as I said before, we know what the end is going to be. They're going to kiss and make up. And it's what we did in the meantime. Irene mentioned Brazil. Brazil has done something very clever. Trump put the tariffs up. So Brazil's exports that same month suffered a lot to the United States, which are not a big part of Brazil's trade anyway. But what Brazil did is they increased automatically their exports to Singapore and to India by over 100%. And at the same time, Lula is talking to Trump. So they're getting the best of both worlds. So I think we have to be more flexible and more pragmatic. That's the new world.
Someone else would like to add something? Yes, Ari.
I just want to add another element of confusion, if you want, to this mix. Yes, we are seeing these major changes, and in answer to your question, Europe is at the moment, shall we say, the center, the anchor of the system, because the United States has essentially stepped down from the position it used to have. But because of what the general said, Europe doesn't have any claims on anybody else, believes in the rule of law. So Europe will maintain the system for the next 4 years until we have a change in the United States. However, I would like to point out to something else. That we keep thinking about trade, we think about military and stuff like that. But there's another element involved here. And that is to say, when you look at migrations, when you look at culture, what are the, shall we say, the dominant, shall we say, societies? It is Europe and the United States. Do you see many people trying to immigrate to China? Do you see people trying to immigrate to Russia? Right? So Europe and the United States, even under Trump, remains the, shall we say, the points of attraction. They still represent something that China, Russia will never be able to duplicate in the near future, because nobody wants to go to a country where you don't have any rights. So that's why I think that we just should not focus on commerce, goods, military. That's it.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to what Carola said and also the general, I think in a way the EU is really a different type of player. Clearly, it's not a political. It is a political player. It could be more of a political player, geopolitical player in that respect. But I think it's really the fact that it's what I hear a lot also with respect of Latin America. It's really the fact that the EU is there for building partnership, right? So it's something so different from the transactional style we see now more and more from the US for sure, but also from other parties. And I think it's important to see that what I was mentioning earlier on about the multi-alignment, the strategic multi-alignment. I think it's for emerging markets and emerging powers, it is a good opportunity to align on those issues where the US is clearly not leading anymore, including obviously climate agenda, but also trade, which is something that obviously trade rule that we have been following for many years, and that Trump has decided. I mean, it was not the only one. I mean, the crisis of WTO and all those kind of things. And I think also I see increasingly for Latin America specifically, the security angle is becoming very important. Actually, the US has a very is adopting a very kind of militaristic. I mean, it's nothing new, but it's basically the same militaristic approach on steroids at the moment, right? Bombing boats in the Caribbean and those kind of things. The EU actually is much more, and I see increasingly involved in security with the region and with other regions as well. And that, of course, is not out of just of generosity, because clearly cocaine is coming much more often to the US, to the EU, and it's becoming a big problem there. But I think there are so many different ways in which one can engage with the EU. Clearly, it's more complicated because it's not one single entity. But I think, to Carola's point, it's really about trying to align with the EU, because it's really, the EU is really in for, I think, more partnership and more long-term kind of support. So I think it's definitely a good partner to align with in many issues.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. First, I thank you for the question. It is very interesting. Is the EU trusted partner? It may sound too pessimistic, but someone has to say it. Therefore, I decided to answer the question as well. In geopolitics, no one is fully reliable. Be it Russia, China, EU, United States, it doesn't matter. No one is fully reliable. Everyone is just pursuing their national interest. And as a students of international relations, you should keep that in mind, that your country should also focus just on its national interest without relying on any country fully. And in Azerbaijan, in the South Caucasus, we have felt it to the extreme level. Amidst this confrontation between Russia and the West, United States and Europe were waiting us to make an either-or choice and to fully align with the West against Russia, without taking care of the fact that if tomorrow Russia attacks Azerbaijan or Georgia, no one is going to fight for us. But nevertheless, all of them were pushing that, no, you have to join the sanctions against Russia, you have to provide military supplies to Ukraine, and whatever. And when we ask the question, what if Russia attacks Azerbaijan in retaliation, no, that's not the answer. Because in Georgia in 2008, when Georgia made the mistake, started a war against Russia with the hope that EU and the United States will support them because of their European choice. Georgia in 2008 started a war because they were thinking that EU and the United States will support them because they opted for European integration, for NATO membership. And when Russian armed forces were just 50 kilometers from the capital of Georgia, none of the Western countries provided military support to Georgia to save itself. So therefore, the answer is clear. Europe is not reliable, China is not reliable, and none of other countries. Thank you.
Emerging countries also had a huge interest in collaborating with Europe because they need, as Europe maybe more than others still believe in a rule-based world order and not only might-based or force-based world order. The rule-based world order, the EU can play a major role in it, and the emerging countries can also be a big ally in this too. This to happen, the emerging also forces or countries needs also to choose to be less opportunistic and more long-term, having long-term strategies, you know, and believe in multilateralism then. And EU also needs also to be maybe more courageous and then to be more independent in its and the EU have a huge common interest in this to play a major role in choosing a strong political leader for the United Nations as the incoming UN Secretary General, and to use it as a pillar for the reform of the new UN we need.
Thank you. I think we might have time for just one more question from the audience, if you can.
Hi, my name is Lawrence Jones. Just for context, I was born in Liberia. I lived in Sweden for 20 years, and I lived in the U.S. So my question would somewhat speak to that. So I have a question I have two questions. The first quick question, is the world really fragmented? Is it more fragmented today than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago? Because 20 years ago, we were still talking about the global south and the global north. That was, to me, fragmentation 20 years ago. So I need to understand what is different now with how the world is. Why do we think the world is more fragmented today than it was 20 years ago? It's because 20 years ago, everyone in Europe talked about Europe and the global south. Everyone in America talked about America and the global south. Why is it more fragmented today than it was 20 years ago? I'm a bit confused because I don't see any different in the world today than it was 20 years ago. What I see is structures that have fallen apart, but the fragmentation that was there 20 years ago is still there. We're still talking about the global north and the global south like we did 20 years ago. So what is the real fragmentation? That's my very first simple question. And my last simple question is, this conversation seemed to have forgotten something that I missed. I do not see the younger generation who will be running the world in the next 25 years. So when we say the world is fragmented, is it fragmented on a generational basis? Because everyone in this room who is a Gen Z will tell you that they spend more time on Facebook with their friends around the world. So is the fragmentation more of a demographical mindset, or is the fragmentation real when it comes to both generations? Thank you.
Thank you for those really thought-provoking and provoking questions at the same time. Would someone like to answer? Yes.
Yeah, I would like to answer the first question. Is the world really fragmented? You know, I believe that it is more fragmented than 20 years ago, in the sense that it is not a matter of the division between global south and global north. And today, for the first time in the post-Soviet period, the world is very close to a world war. And Russia may happen. Russia may attack some NATO member countries, and if it does, it will lead to a world war, apparently. So therefore, from that perspective, military confrontational perspective, I believe that the world is much more fragmented than it was just 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
Yes.
I just wanted to add to your point, just to give you a point. I mean, we just launched our armed conflict survey a couple of days ago. What we see there, even in terms of looking at the conflict landscape, right, is that there is, and that's an example of how I think we see the emergence of new powers, which are actually, as you were saying before, everybody has obviously its strategic agenda. And I think increasingly we see a lot of new power that actually are going after the agenda. So, you know, you see in conflict, for instance, you see lots of third-party intervention. And when 20 years ago the third-party intervening in conflict were the classic one, you know, the Western countries, the US, France, nowadays much different, the landscape. You have, you know, you have the Gulf state, you have the Emirates, you have Turkey, you have Russia, you have a lot of other players, and I think that's actually in the context of what you were saying. Clearly, there are very strong polarization around specific conflict, and of course, I guess the Ukraine conflict has been the most polarizing in terms of, you know, Russia and not Russia. Russia has a lot of soft power still in the global south for legacy reason. It's been very successful also in extending his narrative, but I think there is that. So on the kind of more military point of view, is much more fragmented. You have much more assertive emerging power, middle power, or whatever you want to call them. But also on the economic side, I think it's also important to say that maybe 20 years ago, you know, of course, we in the 60s and 70s we have the alignment movement. There was this idea of, you know, now it's called Global South, but whatever you call them. I think now actually those countries in the those emerging markets in the global south also have the geoeconomic power, right? Because if you look at countries like, you know, India, Nigeria, other emerging power really do have the geoeconomic power. So I think it's a combination of that makes the world a more fragmented, just because you have more actors which actually are following their strategic imperatives, but also have some of the economic power to back that up.
As I mentioned in my initial remarks, and I think you're right, maybe it's just as fragmented, but I think it's more evident now. At the beginning I said that in the middle of this confrontation between the US and China, you have on the one side the multilateral institutions are being eroded by its own creator. China's creating new institutions and a new whole world of multilateralism a la Chinese. And on top of that, you get all this weaponization of trade. So I think it makes it more evident, the fragmentation. Before, if you had a fora that perhaps it didn't work, or maybe it didn't work, for sure it didn't work, but at least we all felt that we had places where we could discuss things and talk about world issues, and it wasn't as fragmented. Now with the erosion of what we had, these new things emerging, new points of view, whether China is the evil that some people think or China is the salvation that other people think. And with this confrontation between the two main powers, making some countries having to choose between one or the other, because I think at the end of the day, and I think for all countries are the same, but particularly for developing countries, we all have to make everyday decisions on things between China and the US. We feel the pressure to do so. Well, there's one that pressures, the other one not, but but we all have, at the end of the day, is all who we're taking sides with. So I think that makes the fragmentation more evident, because also, and that happens when you go, when I was representing Argentina, G20 negotiations, it was evident that we don't have a common agenda. And that happens also when we were at WTO. We think the global south sounds lovely, but at the end of the day, I always say it's like the Hunger Games. It's all very nice, we all cooperate, we all fight, we all make groups, but when we have to kill each other, we just kill each other. And that's the main problem that we have. There's no common agenda. And this world situation has made that, I think, more evident. It was always there, as you said, it was always as fragmented.
Yes, since we have 2 more hours, after the Second World War, our international relations were based on the theory of equality of nations. And that was a result. Why was the US very much behind it? Because in the United States you have 50 states, which the Americans believe are equal in the were built on that pretense, just like they are in our families. You have sisters and brothers. They are all, hopefully, as important under the sun. Now, Russia is developing another concept quite openly that they call the hierarchy of nations, in the sense that there's a ranking of nations. And it just happens that they see themselves basically as co-equal with America, mostly because of their nuclear power, not at all because of their intellectual heft. But it's true, and they say, be pragmatic. Some nations are more powerful than others. And think of that idea. It's not entirely stupid. One of the causes of conflict is when people do not agree with the hierarchy. For example, Georgia 2008 believed it could stand up to us. We had to punch their nose for them to understand. But if they had understood the concept of hierarchy, ranking, and everything will be okay. And it just means that you take orders from the people above you. And there, they don't realize that by making friends with China, China has another concept of international relations, which is called Tiansha, everything under the sky. We, China, are the axis of the world. We are l'Empire Céleste. We are, and it's a very deep-seated belief, not only in political circles. We, China, we are the organizing principle of the universe. Around us are tributaries, those who pay tribute. That is Russia, for example. And beyond are barbarians. The barbarians, it's not a measure of violence or lack of sophistication. It's people who do not understand the universal order. For example, America. America is a barbarian because it does not understand that the governing principle of the world is China. We need to, when we engage with these nations, we need to understand their concept of international relations and see how much we can live with it. Thank you.
Someone would like to have some concluding remarks? In that case, I would like us to say thank you for your attention, and let's give all the participants here, all the speakers, an applaud